Welcome to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you from the Rocky Mountain town of Crested Butte, Colorado. I'm your host, Mark Troutman, CFP. This educational, personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. In this episode, I thought we would discuss my favorite topic, and that is compounding. I've just gotten off the cruise. In the last episode, you heard me talk about some of the kind of technical details around retirement distribution strategies and an alternative to the 4% rule. But I thought we would go back to basics a little bit in this episode and talk about compounding. I was thinking about this prior to this weekend. I thought this would be a good topic. And if any of you are aware, this past weekend was the annual meeting for Berkshire Hathaway. I always watch the meeting. I've been able to do it online for the past couple of years. I've been in attendance for many years in the past. And this year's meeting was quite interesting because this was the first meeting where Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger were not on the stage. Charlie Munger was Warren Buffett's partner and also co-chairman with Warren Buffett for Berkshire Hathaway. Unfortunately, he passed away in November of last year, just 1 month shy of his 100th birthday. And he was always very entertaining, and he was extremely smart. And all the way up until he passed away, his mental acuity was just astounding. So there was a tribute to Charlie Munger in the movie that began the meeting. And right after the movie, Warren was talking about, and I think he was kind of reminiscing because he was thinking about all the years that the two of them have been effectively stewarding what they like to call their partners' resources in Berkshire Hathaway. They view shareholders as partners. And he was talking about how many of the Berkshire shareholders have been very prudent stewards of their own resources. They are not excessive consumers like many of the aristocrats of the past, buying big homes and being very flashy. They live very good lives, but many of them have become extremely wealthy. And to talk about this a little bit further, at the end of the first session, and he answers questions, and it used to be Warren and Charlie answering questions, but now it's Warren and Greg Abel and Ajit Jain, who are the operating managers of Berkshire Hathaway, along with Warren Buffett himself. They answer questions for about 3 hours, then take a lunch break, and then come back and answer questions for another 2 hours. And he was talking about how many of the shareholders have created a lot of wealth by owning Berkshire Hathaway for many, many years. And what I thought was interesting is that he opened with this quote after he was discussing the shareholders being prudent stewards of their resources and not being excessive consumers and spending money like crazy. He quoted this, and this was just so coincidental, I felt, to the fact that I was already contemplating doing this topic on compounding. And he said, the math of compounding in a long time can do wonders. And so I kind of like to think we had a money mind meld. He and I were thinking about the same thing, probably for two different reasons, but we were both thinking about compounding this past weekend. At the end of the first session, he showed a video clip, and that was a video clip at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And there were a whole bunch of students in the audience, and Ruth Gottesman was announcing a gift that she was giving to the school. And she was a past professor at the school, and she was giving a $1 billion gift to the school for free tuition for every student in perpetuity. And the students' reaction was just phenomenal, of course, as you would expect. And Ruth's husband was David, and he went by the name Sandy Gottesman. And he was one of the early investors in Berkshire Hathaway. And he was also a board member of Berkshire Hathaway until his death in September of 2022. I will talk about my own story about compounding, how it relates to Berkshire Hathaway later in this podcast. So why don't I save that discussion until a little bit later? But first, I would like to relay the lesson I teach to the students in my financial literacy class at the local high school. And again, this is my favorite subject. It is also one of the favorite subjects of the students. And the way I like to start the class is starting off with a riddle. And that is, would you rather have a penny that doubles every day or $1 million? And of course, many of the students figure, well, it's got to be a trick question. So I figure it's got to be the penny. And of course, I give them the opportunity to think about it and make a choice. And then I go through the math. And it's interesting. If you were to take your calculator out and just put in 0.01 and then do times 2 equals, and just keep hitting equals for each additional day. So day 1, 1 penny, 2, 2 pennies, and so forth. So 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, 16 becomes 32, 32 becomes 64. So after the 7th day, here we are a quarter of the way through the month almost. And the penny, while it's making progress, is still not even $1 yet. And then I continue and go from day 7 all the way to day 14, and things progress a little bit further. But here we are on day 14, 2 weeks into the month, and that penny has doubled every day, but it's still only $81.92. And then I give the students an opportunity to change their mind. Most don't, because they figure it's still got to be a trick. But it is pretty interesting that we haven't even gotten to $100 and we're almost halfway through. In fact, if we get to the next day, day 15, exactly halfway through, we're now at $163.84. And of course, they figure, well, it's got to cross at some point. So I do ask them, when do you think it will cross the $1 million mark? And if you take your calculator out and you keep hitting equals, 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 you will get to the 28th time you've hit equal. And on day 28, it does cross the $1 million and it gets to $1,342,177. And in fact, by day 30, because you're going to double it 2 more times, it's actually $5,368,709 after doubling every day for 30 days. Now, of course, I say we don't have a magic penny. So since that doesn't exist, what do we have as an alternative for compounding? And I talk a little bit about Warren Buffett. He has been able to compound for a very long period of time at a rate of nearly 20% over his lifetime. And his net worth right now is approximately $140 billion. And he started compounding when he was in his teens, and he is now 93 at a very reasonable rate, or very high rate, in fact, of 20%. And a lot of people might say, oh, well, it's probably through stock options or things like that because he's the chairman of the company. And the answer is actually he has only been paid $100,000 a year maximum at Berkshire Hathaway. All of his net worth is a result of owning the shares in the company and compounding over such a long period of time. Now, we are not Warren Buffett's. So what can we do? Well, we can invest in the stock market. We could invest in an index fund, a broad market index fund like the S&P 500 or total stock market index. And I like to use the example from my students that if you were to invest in the stock market and bond market combined, what are the rates of return? Well, 100% equities is over history has been about 10%. If you had a 70-30 portfolio, so 70% equity, 30% intermediate term bonds, you would have a return of a little bit north of 9%. So I just say, let's use 9% in our example. And then I use the example I like to call of the early bird and the procrastinator. I use the example of investing in your Roth IRA the maximum that you can do each year. And prior to this, and even in prior episodes of this podcast, we've talked about savings rates and appropriate savings rates. So I just use the maximum of the Roth IRA, which is currently $7,000 per year. And so what does that equate to? Well, it equates to a 10% savings rate or investment rate if you were to make $70,000 a year, or 15% if you made approximately $46,667 per year. So certainly doable. And what I like to talk about is a lot of people say, I'll get to that eventually. I'm just starting my job. I've got things to do. I'll save later. And I like to show the example of what would happen if you started at age 22 as soon as you got out of college, because many of the students I'm talking to are going to college, or if you were to delay that for 10 years. And so what I do is I say, let's say you were to contribute $7,000 a year on a monthly basis, which is $583, to your Roth IRA for only 10 years as a 22-year-old. Well, at the end of a 45-year period, and the reason I use 45 years is because you would be age 67 at that point, which is the full retirement age for Social Security, and you would have invested a total of $70,000, $7,000 a year for 10 years. And what is very interesting is that if you were to delay that and wait 10 years and not start contributing the $7,000 a year until you were 32, but continued to save and invest that all the way until age 67, so that would be for 35 years, you would have contributed a total of $252,000. So the 22-year-old invests for 10 years, a total of $70,000. The 32-year-old, 35 years, a total of $252,000. You would think that the 32-year-old, having invested almost 3 to 4 times as much money, would have substantially more money. And the answer is incorrect. The 22-year-old actually ends up with, and this is compounding at 9%, $2,472,918, having contributed only for 10 years and stopping, but starting 10 years prior to their friend who started at age 32, but invested $252,000. And that 32-year-old would end up with a very significant amount still of $1,727,252. However, that is $750,000 less, nearly $750,000 less than the 22-year-old who started early. Now, of course, my students say, well, this is great. I'm going to start at age 22. And then I say, what would happen if you started at age 22, but didn't stop contributing after 10 years and continued all the way through? You would have contributed a total of $322,000, again, well within the capability of someone who is saving 15% of their $46,667 salary or 10% of their $70,000 salary. And if you were to continue those contributions throughout the entire period, you would actually end up with $4,200,171. Quite significant. So, of course, I always tell my students, if you want to be a millionaire, it's relatively easy. Here's how you could do it. And of course, it assumes that the rate of return is achievable. And of course, you can't promise that, but it gives you an idea of if the rates of return of equities are somewhat similar to what they have been in the past, it certainly is doable. So that is my lesson of compounding for my students. Oh, I do want to interject one additional thing. And I like to think of things in crossover points. So if we go back to that penny example, if you recall, it was very, very slow at the beginning. And that is the way that compounding works. It gets very fast at the end. And I use the example of, let's go back to Warren Buffett, $141 billion. Let's say, for simplicity of math, if he would earn 10% on his assets this year, for example, that would be an additional $14 billion. And I believe he didn't even become a billionaire until sometime in his 50s. So while he has $141 billion today, a lot of that has come as a result of the tail end of the compounding. And that's the same for any compounding calculation. And so when people start out and are contributing to their Roth IRAs, for example, let's stay with that example, it looks like it's going very slow at the beginning. It's not until kind of the snowball starts really rolling down the hill and we get towards the bottom of the hill or later in the timeline that compounding really shows up. So I like to think of things in crossover points. And so in the compounding example of the $7,000 per year and at 9%, I just did some quick calculations here. And I like to think of two crossover points. The first one is, and again, this assumes a linear rate of return. And when you invest in stocks, for example, your rates of return are not going to be exactly the same every year. So this is a very hypothetical example because those rates of return, even if you did achieve 9%, are not going to be 9% exactly every year. But let's just use this for explanatory purposes. In the example of investing $7,000 a year or $583 a month, the first crossover point I like to think of is, when is the account appreciating more per year than your contribution? So that's the first kind of crossover point where you start to be like, wow, my account is doing more of the work than I am with contributions. And in the 9% example, it's around year 9 where that happens. So let's say about a decade after contributing an equal amount every year or every month, that's about when that first crossover point happens. The second crossover point I like to think of is, when is the account actually generating more income or gain than I'm actually earning in my own salary? If you were contributing at a rate of 15% of your salary, so that was approximately $47,000 a year, 15% gives you the $7,000. It's in about year 24, 25 when that crossover happens. So if you started at, let's say, 22, around age 47 is when that crossover point is going to happen. Now, if you were only contributing 10% of your salary, so your salary is much higher, $70,000 in that case, it would be around year 29, let's say year 30, just to give it a round number. So for the person who's contributing 15%, it's around year 24, 25. For the person contributing 10%, it's around year 29, 30. That's really when it gets exciting, when you're like, wow, my investments are earning or creating more income than I am in my job. So those are really exciting crossover points to me. So where did I learn about compounding? This is a very interesting story. So my grandmother, she was married to a minister. And as you would expect, ministers do not make a lot of money. And this was down in the South in Georgia and Alabama. I was visiting with her, I think it was in the mid-90s. And I was talking to her about, she owned some stock. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. You own stock. And she was telling me about it and how she came about the ownership of that stock. And the story is, her husband died when he was 57, and she was, I believe, 52 at the time. And he was a minister at a church. He had a heart attack. He passed away. She was fortunate in that the church provided her housing. She had to go back to work. They really didn't have much money. He had a very small life insurance policy. He did have Social Security, so eventually she was able to collect some Social Security benefits on his record. And her stepbrother, who was a banker, suggested that she take some of that life insurance proceeds and buy some dividend-paying stocks. And he advised her to buy 3 stocks for approximately $1,000 each. I think her life insurance policy was that $3,000, maybe $4,000 or $5,000, but it wasn't much more than the $3,000 he was suggesting she invest in a handful of stocks that would provide a dividend income stream to her. One of them was I believe it was Atlanta Gas Light, which is a utility. There was also another utility. I just don't recall what it was. And the third was Coca-Cola. And the Coca-Cola one is the one that was of most interest to me because by the time I was talking to her about this, these Coca-Cola shares were worth quite a bit of money. And I was like, how in the world did you end up with so much value in Coca-Cola stock? And she was telling me the story. And she wrote it all out for me. She had this piece of paper that she gave me, and I'll show it to you here. I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I'm going to hold it up. This is I don't know if it's backwards on the screen or not, but I will try to also clip a picture of it and put it in the YouTube. But she bought 9 shares of Coca-Cola on June 17th, 1964. That is 60 years ago. The total cost, according to her handwritten notes here, she bought 9 shares at $131 per share, which was a total of $1,179. She paid a commission of $13.50 and a registration fee of 35 cents. She actually had the shares in physical form. And so the total cost of these 9 shares was $1,192.85. Now, fast forward to today, those 9 shares, because of stock splits, are now 3,456 shares. She has since passed away, but those shares were left to my mother, and my mother still has those shares. And what's interesting about the ownership of these shares is that just as her stepbrother suggested, she was using the dividends to supplement her income. My mother also receives the dividends on these shares to supplement her income now. And what's very interesting is that the dividends today equate to about $6,700 per year, which is about 6 times the initial cost of those shares. And the current value of those shares is about $215,000 on that $1,200 investment. That works out to an internal rate of return of about 8.7%, but that excludes the dividends because those dividends were not reinvested. If those dividends were reinvested, that rate of return would be much higher. But that was my first lesson in compounding. So it was quite interesting to learn from somebody who really had modest means that they were able to benefit from compounding over, obviously, a very long period of time. Now, my story of compounding, that's where I learned about it. But I recall when I was at my house at one point, and my mother said, I saw this guy on Louis Rukeyser's Wall Street Week that reminded me a lot of you because I was interested in investing. This was in the mid-90s. I was actually working in the investment field at the time. And she said, his name is Warren Buffett, and you may want to check him out. And I did. I looked up who Warren Buffett was. I learned a little bit about Berkshire Hathaway. And ultimately, I ended up buying shares in Berkshire Hathaway, and I looked back in my records, and the first time I bought shares was on January 13th, 1998. So obviously it took me a few years to actually buy the shares after learning about Warren Buffett. But ultimately, I did end up buying shares in January of 1998. And at the time, the A shares, there are two classes of Berkshire shares, A shares and B shares. At the time, the B shares were 1/30th of the A shares, and the A shares were trading at around $47,000 per share. And that's what I paid, around $47,000 per share. And I initially was buying B shares and later would buy A shares. But I'm just going to quote everything in A shares because it's easier, because there was another split of the B shares down the road. I think it was I want to say in the 2000s, and they split 50 for 1. So today the B shares are 1/1500th of the A shares. So today, 26 years later, I still own my Berkshire shares, and those A shares are now worth over $600,000 per share. The A shares have never split. And the internal rate of return on my ownership, at least, is 9.7%. And I do want to caution that this is not investment advice. I'm not suggesting anyone go buy Coca-Cola or Berkshire Hathaway. I'm just using this as an example of how compounding has worked for me, my grandmother, and obviously rates of return will be different going forward. And this is in no way investment advice. I'm just relaying my personal example. And what's interesting is I've learned a significant amount from both Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And Charlie Munger, as I said, was the co-chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, partner of Warren Buffett for decades. I think they were partners for 50 years or so, more than 50 years. And where I've really learned a lot about compounding and many other investment related topics and even life topics are by reading Warren Buffett's letters to shareholders. And as he repeated in this meeting this past weekend, I'll also post a link to the meeting. You can actually watch the entire thing. CNBC has been recording it and broadcasting it for, I believe, the last, I want to say, 5 or 6 years now. I think it started during COVID. And also, as some shareholders get older, I think Warren Buffett realizes that some shareholders can't make their way all the way to Omaha to the annual meeting. So wanted to offer a way for people to see the annual meeting virtually. And COVID was a perfect opportunity to institute that. And they've continued it, which is very helpful. And I'm very thankful of that. So it's a lot easier to just get up on Saturday morning. And I do every year, get my coffee and sit down and watch the meeting. But I have learned an enormous amount from reading the chairman's letters. They are all available on the Berkshire Hathaway website. I will link to that. I will mention that the Berkshire Hathaway website is very rudimentary, I guess you would say. Very basic. And that's fine because it's the content that's important, not all the bells and whistles. I've also learned a lot by attending the annual meetings. I was actually fortunate to be able to ask a question. So shareholders can ask questions. You can either submit them to, it used to be 3 people, and now it's just one, Becky Quick at CNBC. And if you're lucky, she will pick your question, but the chances are pretty low because so many people do submit questions. And also, you can go to the meeting, and there's a handful of microphones. I think there's 10 or 11 microphone stations. And if you get to one of those stations, you get a lottery ticket. And then if you get a low number, you may be able to ask a question. Typically, just 1 or 2 questions from each station are able to be asked because that's how long it takes Warren and was Charlie to answer the question. So they usually only get around twice in the stadium. And then Becky is the one who asks the questions intermittently. The year that I submitted my question, I was able to submit it to Carol Loomis, who was one of the people reading the questions at the time. At the time, there were 3 people reading questions, and Carol Loomis was one of them. What's interesting is that Carol Loomis was an editor at Fortune magazine. She is also the one who has edited Warren Buffett's chairman letter every year for, I believe, the past 50 years. And he recognized her this year at the annual meeting, which was very nice. I didn't realize that she's actually 95 years old this year. It was very nice because she responded to me after I submitted my question. She wanted some clarification. But the question I asked was really for the benefit of my daughter, who also owns shares. She does not own A shares. She owns B shares. But it was about the sustainability of Berkshire Hathaway as an entity beyond Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, and the ability for it to continue in its present form. In other words, what is its sustainable competitive advantage? And what was interesting is that Warren Buffett kind of punted that question over to Charlie, and I love the quote. He said, "Charlie, do you want to talk to Katie?" And we were actually at that meeting, so it was pretty cool. And Charlie had a really good answer. And it was basically about the culture and that they have created a kind of an institutionalized the benefits of Berkshire Hathaway that will last beyond them. And what was interesting is at this current annual meeting, Warren Buffett mentioned that at the beginning of the meeting, basically saying that Charlie Munger was kind of the architect of Berkshire Hathaway, and Warren Buffett was more the contractor or general contractor managing the place after the architect built the institution. So it was, kind of interesting that Charlie answered my question. And as Warren Buffett mentions him being the architect of Berkshire Hathaway, I guess that made a lot of sense that he would be the one to answer that question. So I feel very fortunate in that I was able to get that question answered, and also that they were able to answer a question, because a lot of people like to present questions, but not everyone gets to. So the chairman's letters are available online. I kind of view it as if you want a masterclass or even kind of an MBA in how to think about investing, especially long-term investment, long-term compounding, ignoring the noise, staying within your circle of competence, I highly recommend you read the chairman's letters from beginning to end. And honestly, it's free, obviously, but it is an excellent class, I guess you would say. If you were to just read all of the annual reports, you will learn a ton of information by just reading those. And there's also a book that has, I think it's in its 4th edition. It's called Poor Charlie's Almanack. The most recent edition was meant to be released in, I think, December of last year. But then when Charlie passed away, I think they made some minor revisions. I've not actually read the current edition yet. It's sitting on my desk upstairs. I've been meaning to do that. But that is another great book that was published shortly after he passed away last November. And that was 1 month shy of his 100th birthday. So I know that was a long-winded discussion of talking about compounding, but like I said, it is my favorite subject. I frankly believe that especially anyone who's very young, if you really want to be a millionaire, it is quite easy. All you'd really need to do is max out your Roth IRA. That's available to everyone. And if you have a retirement plan at work, certainly you could use that as the vehicle. And the reason I like the Roth is because, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, if you contribute to that, you do not get a tax deduction, but all of the gains are tax-free forever. Now, there are some nuances as to when you can access those funds, so you can listen to previous episodes about that. But I think the Roth IRA is a great vehicle for long-term accumulation, especially if you're going to have some substantial gains that may occur as a result of your very long timeline, and hopefully decent returns at the same time. So that's it about compounding. Next week, I may decide to answer a question. I got a question in from someone asking about how to think about taking a pension, whether to take the pension or a lump sum. So maybe I will get to that. It's kind of a follow-on to the discussion that was released last week, the discussion that I had with Becky Heptig and Bill Yount of Catching Up to FI, talking about drawdown strategies in retirement. Pensions can play a big role in that if you have one. And so I think I'll try to answer that at least at the end of that podcast, if not potentially even dedicate the whole podcast to it. We'll see. But stay tuned. I kind of just think about what I want to talk about the week leading up to the release of the episode, and who knows what comes out. So I hope you enjoyed this. And again, this was not in any way meant to be investment advice. I'm not suggesting you buy Coca-Cola or Berkshire Hathaway. I was simply using it as an example to give you some insight into where I learned my lesson of compounding. Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps improve the ranking and enables other like-minded people find the content in their podcast players. If you would like me to answer a question on the show, please send it to mark@marksmoneymind.com and put podcast question in the subject line. Let me know your first name, or let me know if you would like to remain anonymous, and also your state of residence if you choose. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next week on the Mark's Money Mind Show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. And now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.